Okay, so here we go with chapter 7B. We talked in the first chapter all about neurons and the function of neurons and how they communicate to everywhere in the body. And we're going to go a little bit more global, a little bit bigger, and talk about the brain and the spinal cord, the central nervous system. We'll come later and talk about the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, and most of the neural tissue located in the entire body is located in the brain and the spinal cord. We're going to get into the specific regions of the brain and some anatomic structures related to that. So we're really just going to go step by step through the brain and then the spinal cord and talk about, in this lecture, the general regions and the areas of the brain and what their functions are. So this is all just kind of memorization type stuff. We'll come back later and talk about some pathways and put some of these structures together and talk more about function and mechanisms. But for now, the brain, the cerebrum, which is the big part of your brain up here, is separated into two hemispheres, the right and the left cerebral hemisphere. The superficial layer, this outermost layer of the cerebrum, is called the cortex, the cerebral cortex. And it has some really fancy functions: conscious thought, memory storage and processing, sensory processing. So we talked about sensory neurons in the last lecture. Those sensory neurons that send information from peripheral receptors to the central nervous system, a lot of them send signals to the sensory processing centers that we'll talk about in the located in the cerebral cortex, and then regulate skeletal muscle functions as well. There's another major area of the brain of the cerebral cortex where control of skeletal muscle is handled. Look at these surface features that you see here. So these bumps that you see are called gyri. The valleys between the gyri are called sulci. There's a little groove here, and a deeper groove is called a fissure. So the shallow depressions are called sulci. The really deep grooves here are called fissures. So we're just going to overview some of the major areas of the brain, and we'll come back and talk about specifics here later. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain here. That basically coordinates, receives sensory information, and sends motor information to the cerebral cortex. So it can communicate back and forth between the cerebrum to coordinate motor functions like walking and repetitive movements like that. The diencephalon, so if you see this area here that's kind of pink, green, and blue, and then pink again, that section of the brain is basically expanded here, where like this connection would be the cerebellum, and then up around here would be the cerebrum. This area here is called the diencephalon, the purple area here. And the diencephalon has two components, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Remember, hypo was under, so under the thalamus. Those two areas make up this region called the diencephalon. And the diencephalon is its name, it originates basically from during development. One of the areas of development is a diencephalon, and it develops into the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The midbrain, basically, so the major structures here are the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, made up of the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and then the brainstem. And the brainstem is colored here in green, blue, and I'm going to call it an orangish pink color. Those three areas are called the midbrain in green, the pons in the blue, and the medulla oblongata in the kind of orangish pink. So in the midbrain, all of those three structures make up the brainstem. The midbrain helps process visual and auditory information, and it helps maintain consciousness. So again, we'll come back and talk about major functions. We'll talk about these functions in detail later. The pons is the blue part here. The pons is a form of, basically serves in a number of different ways. The pons can connects to the cerebellum. So any information being processed and sent to the cerebellum, or being processed in the cerebellum, being sent out from the cerebellum, makes its way through the pons. So the pons is this unique area that connects and allows for communication between the cerebellum and the cerebrum, and the cerebellum and everywhere else in the body, like the spinal cord. So any information making its way to and from the cerebellum has to go through the pons to get there. But the pons also has its own job. It functions and has some centers in the pons that control functions like respiration, breathing. So we'll talk about those centers later. And then the medulla oblongata is another relay center. And this basically, if you think about it, the medulla oblongata is what connects the spinal cord to the rest of the brain. So any sensory information making its way up to the brain, or any motor information making its way from the brain down to the spinal cord, has to make its way through the medulla oblongata to get there. Similar to the connection between the pons and the cerebellum. But there's a relay center here, but the medulla also contains some centers that regulate heart rate and blood pressure. So there's what's called autonomic regulation centers there. And remember, the autonomic nervous system is the nervous system part of the motor division that controls motor functions and functions in like the heart and can control, again, visceral functions like cardiovascular functions. So there's a cardiovascular center there that controls both, modulates changes in heart rate and the force of heart muscle contraction, but also blood pressure. Within the cerebrum, there are chambers called ventricles. And these chambers are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Remember, ependymal cells are a type of glial cell that we talked about in the last lecture for chapter 7a, where these ependymal cells secrete cerebrospinal fluid into these chambers. Well, the chambers in the brain are called ventricles. Think about ventricles in the heart. They're chambers in the heart where blood fills. Well, the chambers in the brain that are filled are called ventricles as well. They're just filled with cerebrospinal fluid as opposed to blood in the heart. There's two large lateral ventricles. I'll show you them on the next slide. There's a figure, so if you want to flip ahead to that, or if you have that on the notes and you're looking at it, the lateral ventricles are in the cerebrum, and they are separated by what's called an interventricular between the ventricles foramen that connects those two lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. So the lateral ventricles are separate. There's one on the left side, one on the right side of the cerebrum, one in the left hemisphere, one in the right hemisphere. Those two ventricles connect to the third ventricle that's located in the diencephalon. Remember, the diencephalon is made of the thalamus and the hypothalamus by way of the interventricular foramen. So from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, there's another connection called the cerebral aqueduct. And it's basically a tunnel that connects the third ventricle to the fourth. And the connections between the ventricles allow for flow of cerebral spinal fluid from one ventricle to another. So here's what it looks like. If you haven't looked here yet, or if you weren't here yet, there's a right and left lateral ventricle. So these are ventricles 1 and 2. Right here's the interventricular foramen. So the blue in here is just space. It's chambers where CSF is located. So the interventricular foramen, you can see it here as well. There's one on either side that connects the lateral ventricle on that side to the third ventricle. So in here would be the diencephalon, but there's a chamber there where CSF is located. And then the cerebral aqueduct carries and transports CSF to the fourth ventricle that's located, take a look back over here, basically under the cerebellum. So it's the cerebral aqueduct runs in here, and then the fourth ventricle is located right here. And then there's a central canal, a long, thin chamber canal that runs down through the spinal cord, where there's also ependymal cells. They're basically all just secreting CSF. They line these chambers in the canals where CSF is secreted. We'll come back and talk about cerebrospinal fluid here again later. Again, I'm introducing some structures here, and I'll come back and talk about more detail related to these structures as we go. So the corpus callosum, there are some connections in the brain. And these connections allow for communication between one area of the brain and another. So to connect the right hemisphere of the cerebrum to the left hemisphere of the cerebrum, there's a structure called the corpus callosum. So there's fibers, basically neuronal fibers, meaning axons, that run from right side to left side or left side to right side and create this structure called the corpus callosum. Nuclei in the brain are groups of cell bodies. Remember, we talked about a nucleus versus a ganglia in the last lecture, a ganglia is a collection or a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Well, that cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system is called a nucleus. So there's a collection of nuclei called the basal nuclei in each cerebral hemisphere. And that these basal nuclei control basically muscle tone subconsciously. So like when you're sitting up in a chair and you don't have to think about sitting up in a chair, the muscles that keep you erect, you don't have to think about. And those muscles of like repetitive movements like walking or running, the basal nuclei basically just helps direct movements like that, the repetitive movements that you don't have to think about. So you just kind of subconsciously just do them. You don't think about taking a step when you take a step, you just do it. So the basal nuclei, along with the cerebellum, control those types of movements. So they work together very closely. Right here's the corpus callosum. So if this is a frontal section of the brain and kind of sliced it open, you can pull away the anterior posterior part, and you can see the corpus callosum. There's the fibers that run from right to left. And then the basal nuclei are embedded. So right here are the lateral ventricles that we just talked about. There's the interventricular foramen and the third ventricle. And then the diencephalon is located right around in here. And the basal nuclei are located just nearby, but they're embedded actually in the cerebral hemispheres. Surrounding and protecting the brain and all of its structures are called meninges. And these are called cranial meninges because they surround the brain. We also have spinal meninges that surround the spinal cord. And there's 3 layers. The dura mater is the outermost really tough layer that is protective. One of the layers, there's actually 2 layers of dura mater. One layer connects to the bone and it's fused to the periosteum, the outermost connective tissue layer of bone, so think cranial bones. And the innermost layer basically lines the brain with 2 layers of meninges deep to that. So the next layer in is called the arachnoid matter. It's called the arachnoid matter because it kind of looks like a spider web. So think arachnid is spider. That the outer layer basically just creates this mesh network that looks like a spider web, which is why it's called arachnoid matter. And deep to that is where the pia mater is located. Between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater is called the subarachnoid, below arachnoid matter, just underneath it is a subarachnoid space. And that's basically where you can find cerebral spinal fluid that surrounds and cushions the brain. The innermost layer of meninges is the pia mater, and that's the really delicate membrane that actually connects directly to the brain. So if you think the gyri and the sulci in the brain and the fissures in the brain, the pia mater just lines that and contours those lines directly. So here's what it looks like. Right here's the skull. So there would be one of the skull bones. This is the outer layer of dura mater and the inner layer of dura mater. And there's a cavity between the two called a sinus. Deep to that is arachnoid matter. So here's the folds of the arachnoid matter. And between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater is the subarachnoid space. And in here, again, is cerebrospinal fluid. That's where cerebrospinal fluid kind of floats around in there and cushions the brain. And the structure within those areas where cerebrospinal fluid is produced is called the choroid plexus. So basically the choroid plexus is a layer of basically a capillary network, really small blood vessels that are lined by ependymal cells. Remember, ependymal cells secrete CSF. So the larger structure that's lined by ependymal cells, basically blood vessels lined by ependymal cells, make up what's called the choroid plexus. And that choroid plexus right here is like in pink right here and pink right there, that secretes CSF into the lateral ventricles and into the third ventricle. And then that CSF, follow the arrows, makes its way into the fourth ventricle, out of the fourth ventricle, around the cerebellum, up around the brain. And then it actually, that cerebrospinal fluid, again, CSF is like basically cleaned out blood minus blood cells. So it's like plasma, the fluid component of blood, but a little bit cleaner. So when it gets secreted and gets sent from the blood through ependymal cells, it gets cleaned out. Ependymal cells then secrete that clean fluid, CSF, into the chambers, and then it circulates out into the brain and around the brain, but then that makes its way back up into veins called, this big vein here that is called a sinus. It's the superior sagittal sinus. Makes its way back out into the venous side of circulation. Remember, circulation has an arterial side, arteries, and a venous side, veins. So CSF is basically fluid that is being sent from the blood into the brain once it gets cleaned, and then it makes its way from the brain and chambers of the brain back into the blood on the venous side, and basically gets recirculated. Here's a larger view of that. So here's a capillary, right? These are capillaries. This would be the cells that line the ependymal cells. All of this is the choroid plexus. So I said it was capillaries, basically lined by ependymal cells, right? These ependymal cells secrete CSF and produce it, send it into the space in the brain. And it can exchange basically waste products and nutrients and whatnot, and basically provide nutrients to the structures of the brain that need it, and at the same time remove waste. So we're going to come into these bigger structures in the brain and talk about their specific functions. In the cerebral cortex, where there's all this higher function happening, in the right and the left hemispheres, they're divided into regions called lobes. So similar to the bones that we talked about, like the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the temporal bone, the occipital bone, the lobes of the brain are named very similarly. There's a fifth lobe that's deep to those external. So the frontal lobe right here would be the frontal bone, right? Two parietal lobes where you have the parietal bones, a temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. So just like the bones of the skull, they're named similarly. These darker colors here, we'll talk about what the heck that means, what they are later. The insula is a fifth lobe, but right here you have to basically dig between the outer layer of the cortex to get to the inner layer of the cerebral cortex to find the insula. There are deep grooves. There's either a sulcus or a fissure, basically. There's these deeper grooves that separate the lobes, that actually creates the frontal lobe and separates the frontal lobe from the parietal or temporal lobes. On here you can see it's cut out of this actually. So right here is the central sulcus. This line here is pointing to the central sulcus, but I think it is cut out of the figure here. But this central sulcus basically divides the frontal lobes from the parietal lobes. And there's two really important gyri here. Remember the gyri, the big bumps, the folds basically. The precentral gyrus before the central sulcus, and the post-central gyrus posterior to the central sulcus. Those two gyri are really important areas of the brain. The post-central gyrus, you can see here, is basically where the primary sensory cortex is located. So when sensory neurons are sending information to the brain, that information, basically action potential information, gets sent all the way to the post-central gyrus, where the primary sensory cortex is located. So sensory information is being sent to that area of the brain to be integrated. The precentral gyrus has a location called the primary motor cortex. So where skeletal muscle is basically controlled, the integration center here and the control center for skeletal muscle contraction, most of it is located right here. Not all of it, but most of it. And that's the primary motor cortex. The lateral sulcus separates the frontal lobe, basically, from the temporal lobe. And then there's a parieto-occipital lobe, or parieto-occipital sulcus that separates the occipital lobe from parietal. There's the central sulcus. So here's a good view of that it's labeled. It's basically the same figure, but it actually points out the central sulcus right here. And then there's the post-central gyrus, where the primary motor cortex is located. And a cortex in the brain is a region where there are cell bodies of neurons that all perform a similar function. Like the primary sensory cortex is receiving information from sensory receptors. And the primary motor cortex is an area that is controlling motor information and sending signals to motor neurons to control skeletal muscle function. Okay, moving on. So the diencephalon. So we talked about the cerebral cortex and its major functions, the lobes, what separates the lobes, and two major cortexes there. Again, cortexes are areas or regions of the brain that perform a particular function. The diencephalon we talked about that makes it, basically what makes up the diencephalon is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The posterior portion of the diencephalon also contains a small tiny gland called the pineal gland that produces melatonin. And that basically melatonin, when you turn the lights out at night, melatonin production goes up and it helps you drift off into dreamland and fall asleep. So the thalamus, I have it huge on this slide because it's so incredibly important. It's a relay center. The thalamus basically receives all sensory information that will make its way to the cerebral cortex and filters that information and sends that information to a specific point in the cerebral cortex. So basically it's like an air traffic controller for your brain. It's a relay center that basically receives all information and then relays that information to the cerebral cortex exactly where it needs to go. And most of that information is sent to some point in the primary sensory cortex. Remember, the primary sensory cortex is located on the post-central gyrus of the cerebrum. And basically that just coordinates voluntary and involuntary motor commands. So any information, sensory information making its way to the primary sensory cortex, or any information making its way from the brain to lower areas like the brainstem or the spinal cord, has to make its way through the thalamus. The hypothalamus is really fancy. It's got a lot going on. It actually has eight major functions, and all of them are extremely different. So the hypothalamus has so much. It's a really small area of the brain, but there's a lot going on. It basically serves as part of the limbic system. And your limbic system is made up of a bunch of structures that control emotion, for lack of a better simplification. So rage, pleasure, pain, sexual arousal, things like that, the emotion that comes along with that is controlled by the limbic system. And the hypothalamus has a nucleus, a collection of cell bodies, remember, like a ganglion in the peripheral nervous system, a nucleus that is part of the limbic system. But there's other nuclei that control other functions of the hypothalamus. So there's lots of different nuclei, collections of cell bodies that perform a similar function in the hypothalamus. One of those centers is kind of considered an autonomic center. So it helps control visceral functions like changes in heart rate, blood pressure, breathing. When the pons, basically it's a communication center between the pons and the medulla to control autonomic functions like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration. The hypothalamus also coordinates the nervous system and endocrine functions of the nervous system. So to do that, the hypothalamus has neurons that communicate to another structure called the pituitary gland. And then the hypothalamus also has neurons that communicate to the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland has an innermost portion. Remember, the adrenal gland is right on, the small gland that sits on top of the kidney. The innermost portion of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal medulla. And the hypothalamus has neurons with axons that extend all the way to the adrenal medulla and communicate to that organ. But the hypothalamus can secrete its own hormones. So it's an endocrine organ itself. Endocrine meaning secretion of hormones. So it secretes hormones like antidiuretic hormone, that's ADH, and oxytocin. So it secretes its own hormones. It also has neurons that communicate to other areas. It has neurons that communicate to other areas of the brain itself that control autonomic functions. It also has centers that sense changes in hunger and thirst and can help control, basically integrate information about those two functions. Can help regulate body temperature. So your core temperature that your body basically maintains a certain set point is located in the hypothalamus. And then it can coordinate other daily activity cycles. So it has just so many different functions. It's insane. The hypothalamus is really intricate. And you can see where they're located here. So here's there's the thalamus. This kind of oval shaped structure is the thalamus. At the center of the thalamus, there's an area that connects the right side to the left side. So there's two thalamic lobes. There's one lobe of the thalamus on the right side of the brain and one on the left. And there's a connection between the two right here. And the hypothalamus is this area here that's kind of a little bit anterior, but under, so deep, maybe hypo means under, right? So under the thalamus. And then you can kind of see this structure here is the pituitary gland. And that's where the hypothalamus can connect and communicate to the pituitary gland, because it basically controls it and controls the secretions of the pituitary gland. And back here is a little pineal gland that secretes melatonin. Down to the brainstem. The brainstem has the midbrain. In the figure, it is green, that processes visual and auditory information. We'll point out some structures there. The pons and the medulla. So we'll go into these in detail. We've already kind of talked about the midbrain. So the medulla is really interesting in that it's got its own function, but it also serves as a relay center. So the pons and the medulla oblongata are similar in that they're relay centers. The medulla is a relay center to allow information to get up, sensory information to get up to the brain, and motor information to get down from the brain towards the spinal cord. But the pons is that same communication piece between the cerebellum and everything else in the either brain or spinal cord. But it also has its own function. So it has a cardiovascular center that adjusts heart rate and the strength of contraction in the heart, but also blood pressure. And there's respiratory centers there that's basically set the pace for your breathing rate in breaths per minute. And then there's also connections, and there's cell bodies, there's nuclei located there for some of the cranial nerves that we'll talk about here shortly. So here's the midbrain, the pons. Again, it has respiratory centers, autonomic centers here that control breathing, along with the medulla oblongata and the hypothalamus. And then the medulla we just talked about. The cerebellum is this large area here that its major job is to adjust and maintain balance. So while you're standing up, you don't fall over when somebody pushes you, because you've got the cerebellum kind of responding to changes in balance. As you walk, as you run, as you change position, the cerebellum receives information about that change in position and can adjust your movements so that you don't fall over and you stay stable all day long. So it not only adjusts that, but it fine-tunes those movements, and it works with the basal nuclei to coordinate and fine-tune those movements so basically you don't have choppy movements and you can kind of smoothly walk and run throughout the day. An EEG, we're going to talk about briefly, is an electroencephalogram. And basically, it's like an EKG for your heart, but for your brain. So it shows brain waves. And it can measure brain activity by placing electrodes on the scalp and then recording the electrical activity. Basically, as neurons fire action potentials, the sum of billions of neurons that are producing action potentials, that's what these electrical impulses are, gets recorded by the EEG. And you can show abnormal brain activity like seizures, and can diagnose disorders like epilepsy or even brain death with an EEG. And there's different waves on the EEG that you can use to do that. These 4 waves, alpha, beta, theta, delta, are the waves that are shown on an EKG tracing. Alpha waves tend to indicate someone who is healthy, awake, but resting with their eyes closed. So if you're just kind of zoning out, not paying attention, maybe just laying on the couch with your eyes closed and not thinking about anything, alpha wave activity would be really high. Beta waves would indicate, changes in beta waves would indicate somebody concentrating. So think about doing a mental math problem. If you're concentrating on that, your beta wave activity would be really high. So all the neurons involved in completing that task would be firing action potentials. And that would be recorded on an EEG tracing on the graph as a beta wave. Theta waves are mostly, these are mostly active when you're asleep in normal adults, or when there's intense frustration in adults. So sometimes these can be seen active in brain disorders, but for the most part, theta waves are most active during sleep in healthy adults. And then delta waves, we're not quite sure exactly what they do, but we're thought that basically deep sleep is when delta waves are most active. Waking adults that are awake but with brain damage, and infants tend to show high activity in delta waves. So here's what they look like. So this is what a typical alpha wave looks like, a really weird amplitude and an odd change in frequency. Beta waves are a much higher frequency, so they spike more often, right? But also have kind of an abnormal pattern. They tend to have a higher amplitude and a higher frequency than alpha waves. Theta waves have a relatively low frequency, but a pretty high amplitude. And then delta waves have a really low frequency, but a really high amplitude. All right, I will see you in the last lecture. We have one more to go. It's just a couple of slides, maybe 13 or 14, so it should be pretty short. So I'll see you soon.